All right. Diving in today, folks, we're tackling something really, really fundamental to how we all kind of move through the world, social perspective taking. And you, our listeners, you guys flagged this as something you wanted to wrap your heads around and do it pretty efficiently. So here we are, mission accepted. We've got some fascinating research to dig into, specifically this piece by Hunter Gilbach. It's called A New Perspective on Perspective Taking. And the goal here, I think, is to kind of blow up those simple definitions we usually get and really get at what it means to grasp what's happening in someone else's head.
Yeah, I mean, right off the bat, what grabbed me was, like, Gelbach really pushes back against this idea that perspective taking is just one thing. You know,
Mhm.
for ages, it's been seen as this single ability or this consistent, like, tendency we all have.
Right, right.
But, he argues this super narrow view, it cripples our understanding,
Yeah.
especially when we try to apply it to messy real life stuff like disagreements.
No,
The big takeaway here is that thinking about perspective taking as this one-dimensional thing, it actually makes us blind to these crucial aspects of why we connect with others or why we clash.
and he uses this killer quote from Catch-22 to get this across. I love this. So it's the chaplain talking to Yossarian, and Yossarian says, "Imagine that you are me." And the chaplain goes, "That's hard. Sometimes I even have trouble imagining that I'm me, if you know what I mean." It's funny, but man, it really highlights that difficulty, right? Like not just actually stepping into someone else's shoes, which is hard enough, but sometimes we just don't even have the will to try. So let's unpack this. Why is this simple view so inadequate?
Well, if we go back to, like, Johnson's definition from 1975, which is a decent place to start, I
Yeah.
guess he talks about understanding another person's thoughts and feelings and, recognizing that their viewpoint might not be the same as yours. Solid, right?
Makes sense.
But it's all about ability. Can you do it? And it totally ignores this whole other piece, which Gelbach calls propensity-like, the motivation, the actual drive to engage in perspective taking.
Right.
And that's huge. I mean, you might have all the mental tools to understand someone, but if you just don't have the oomph to use them, then
Yeah.
what's the point?
It's like knowing you could go to the gym versus actually getting off the couch and doing it.
Exactly. You nailed it. And this gap, this is where things get really interesting. When we only look at ability, we're stuck. We can't answer these basic questions like, do we need both? Ability and motivation. Can someone be super motivated but kind of lousy at it and still make it work?
Oh.
Or the other way around. And then the big one. How does this situation, the actual context we're in, how does that change things? A one-dimensional view, it just doesn't equip us to deal with this complexity. The main point here is that we can't understand how we connect with others by just looking at whether we can understand them. We need to know if we even want to.
And this really jumps out when we look at like conflict resolution, right? This
Yeah.
is where perspective taking is always brought up as like the magic bullet.
For sure.
From those everyday squabbles to, a serious stuff. The text even talks about school violence, these horrific events, Littleton, Santee, Erfurt, and how understanding these dynamics is so crucial to preventing them. So how is this link between perspective taking and conflict? How's it been studied?
So it's mainly been studied in these two separate ways, just like we were saying, looking at propensity, then looking at ability, but not together.
Mm.
When researchers go the propensity route, they usually use those self-report surveys,
Yeah.
asking people how often they try to put themselves in someone else's shoes.
Right.
Davis's interpersonal reactivity index, that's a common one. It has a whole section for that. And there's been some interesting findings, like Corcoran and Mallinckrodt. They found a connection between, like, this self-reported tendency and using more collaborative conflict resolution styles, like compromising or integrating, trying to find those win-win solutions. So the people who say they try to understand others, they're more likely to look for that middle ground.
Okay, so people who say they try to see other perspectives are more likely to compromise, to find a solution that works for everyone. Sounds good, but
But, as Gelbach points out, and the researchers themselves kind of admit, there's a big catch. Just because someone says they tried doesn't mean they're actually good at it.
Mm.
I mean, what if these people with, like, high propensity, what if they're just constantly misreading everyone? Their attempts to compromise, to integrate, it could all be based on, like, a totally messed up understanding of what the other person actually wants or feels. The surprise here is that just wanting to understand someone doesn't automatically mean you actually do.
right, their heart's in the right place, but their efforts could just backfire spectacularly. So what about looking at ability then? How do they actually measure that?
So that usually involves these tasks that are designed to, like, test how accurately someone can figure out what another person is thinking or feeling. Like Ike's has this videotape method, which is pretty neat.
Okay.
You have people interact, right?
Yeah.
And then they watch the recording separately and like jot down their own thoughts and feelings at certain points. Then they watch it again. But this time, they try to guess what their partner was thinking or feeling in those same moments. Then you measure how accurate they were. It's a pretty direct way to see how well someone can, like, step into another person's mental space.
So what did studies using this method find about conflict resolution?
Well, there's this study by Bissonnette and his colleagues. They worked with newly married couples, and they found that, yeah, when people were more accurate at perspective taking, they were better at avoiding those behaviors that escalate conflict,
Uh,
and they had better relationships overall. But, and this is important, they noticed this relationship got weaker over time.
oh.
And their interpretation was that maybe as the marriage became more, settled, the couples just weren't as motivated to actually use their perspective-taking abilities to prevent arguments. So even if you can accurately understand your partner, you might not always choose to use that skill to smooth things over.
So the honeymoon phase effect. That initial motivation to really understand each other might fade as the relationship becomes more routine. This really hammers home the point that looking at just propensity or just ability is a bit like, I don't know, trying to understand a painting with only half the colors.
Precisely. And to really get the full picture, we need to figure out how these two things work together. Like, can one make up for the other? Or are they both absolutely essential for, navigating conflict effectively? This is where Gelbach brings in this theory by Richard Snow called situated aptitude theory. It's like a broader lens for understanding this whole thing.
Okay, so we've seen that just looking at ability or motivation alone isn't enough. What is this theory, this Snow theory, and how does it apply to social perspective taking?
So Snow's big idea is that we need to think about aptitudes, things like social perspective taking, not just as these fixed traits that we're born with, but as something that's constantly being shaped by the situation. It's not just about who you are, but about who you are in that specific context. So when you try to take someone's perspective, there are these like different paths you can go down, right? You might understand them perfectly, you might totally miss the mark, you might realize you just don't know, or you might just give up. And your propensity, that motivation we were talking about, it plays a huge role in which path you take. The key point here is that understanding other people isn't just this internal thing. It's totally intertwined with the world around us.
The situation isn't just a backdrop, it's an active participant in how we approach and whether we succeed or fail at perspective taking.
Totally. And Snow breaks down aptitudes into these three key ideas. First, there's multidimensionality. He says that aptitudes involve cognition, so that's our thinking processes, affect, which is our feelings, and cooperative, which is our will or motivation.
Yep.
So when we apply that to social perspective taking, Gelbach proposes these two pathways. There's the commitment pathway, which is driven by motivation and emotion regulation, and that leads to our propensity for perspective taking, how often we actually try to understand others.
Okay.
And then there's the performance pathway, which is based on our cognitive abilities, things like understanding language, using perspective-taking strategies, and just our general thinking style. And this pathway, it shapes our actual ability to take perspective accurately. The takeaway here is that being good at understanding others means both being motivated to do it and having the mental tools to pull it off.
So we need both pathways, both the desire and the skills to be really effective. What's the second idea from Snow?
The second one is about layers of the environment. He talks about this thing called a problem space, which includes not only the specific perspective-taking task itself, like trying to figure out why your friend is upset, for example, but also the wider context, like maybe you're in a noisy coffee shop or you're both stressed about something else entirely.
Right.
And both the task and the context, they have these things he calls constraints and affordances, things that make it harder or easier to take someone's perspective. Think of constraints as roadblocks and affordances as helping hands.
Okay, so like if your friend is usually very open, that would be an affordance. It makes it easier to understand what's going on with them.
Yeah.
But if you're in a crowded place, that would be a constraint because it's hard to focus.
Exactly. But Snow says that even more important than the actual constraints and affordances is how you perceive the environment. And this perception, it can change from moment to moment depending on the interaction. He gives this example of students seeing their strict English teacher in the hallway. So the task is trying to figure out the teacher's mood, and the hallway is the context. But if the teacher suddenly smiles and says hello in a really friendly way, well, the student's whole perception of her changes, right? And their ability and willingness to take her perspective probably shifts dramatically too. The point is that our interpretation of a situation, it can be more important than the actual situation itself when it comes to understanding others.
Yeah, it's not just about the objective reality, but how we interpret it. That really matters. And the third part of Snow's theory.
The third one is that aptitudes are both processes and products. He's saying that perspective taking isn't just a skill we use to achieve other things, like to resolve conflicts, for example. It's also something that we can learn and develop on its own. So we should study it both as a means to an end, like how does it help us achieve other goals, but also as an end in itself, like how do we actually get better at perspective taking. And this is especially important for educators. Snow saw education as this process of developing these kinds of aptitudes, and understanding that perspective taking is both process and product can give us some real insights into how to teach it effectively. The main point is that getting better at understanding others, it's not just about some talent you're born with, it's a skill you can actually cultivate.
Okay, so we've got this multi-layered view of perspective taking now. We've got the commitment and performance pathways, the influence of the situation, and this idea of it being both a skill and a goal. So let's break down those personal factors that influence our propensity and ability, starting with the commitment pathway motivation and emotion regulation.
Right, so motivation, as we kind of touched on before, seems pretty intuitively linked to both how often we try to take someone's perspective, propensity, and how good we are at it when we do ability.
Yeah.
Like, if you're really invested in understanding someone, you're just more likely to put in the effort.
Right.
There's this work by Eccles on motivation in academic settings. He found that when students valued a subject and believed they could do well in it, they were more likely to actually engage with it in the future. I think that probably applies here too. If you value understanding others and you think you can actually do it, you're more likely to keep trying.
Yeah.
So the more you value understanding others and the more you believe you can, the more effort you're going to put in.
And the research seems to back that up, at least in terms of ability. Like that study by Ikes found that just being interested in the other person, even something as simple as finding them attractive, it actually made people better at perspective taking.
Exactly. Yeah. But there's this really interesting counter-argument from Simpson and his colleagues. They found that in close relationships, sometimes people might actually be motivated to be inaccurate,
Oh, wow.
like to avoid conflict or protect the relationship. So while generally, yeah, motivation seems to boost accuracy, our specific goals in a given situation can throw a wrench in things. Sometimes we might subconsciously avoid truly understanding someone just to keep the peace.
That's fascinating. Sometimes not understanding might feel safer, at least in the short term. What about emotion regulation? How does our ability to manage our feelings play into all of this?
Oh, that's huge, especially in conflict situations, which are often emotionally charged, right? Being able to regulate your emotions, it can be crucial. If you can manage those negative feelings, you're more likely to be open to seeing the other person's side, and you're probably going to be better at processing their perspective without your own emotions, clouding your judgment. Emotion regulation is like clearing away the mental fog that can prevent you from truly understanding another person's perspective.
Yeah. And Mendoza talks about how fear can play a role here. Like the fear that if we empathize with someone too early in a conflict, we might feel weak or like we're giving up some of our bargaining power.
Right.
But on the other hand, caring about the other person or even seeing perspective taking as a way to manage our own anger, that could make us more willing to try.
Exactly. And while there's not a ton of research directly connecting emotion regulation to perspective taking yet,
Hmm.
we know from other fields, like education, there's this work by Roser showing that negative emotions can really hinder academic performance, that our emotional state has a big impact on our cognitive abilities. So it's not a stretch to think that being able to regulate our emotions would also lead to more accurate perspective taking. Managing your own emotions can pave the way to a clearer understanding of others.
Okay, so motivation gets us in the game, and emotion regulation keeps us focused and receptive. Now let's jump to the performance pathway, those cognitive factors. We've got cognitive level, strategy, and cognitive style. Let's start with cognitive level, basically. Intelligence. What's the connection there?
Well, the research hasn't really found a clear link between intelligence and how often people try to take others' perspectives. But there does seem to be a small but noticeable link with how accurate they are when they do try. Davis and Krauss did a meta-analysis that found a small positive correlation. And Selman, with his stages of perspective taking, which are pretty cognitively demanding, he found a stronger correlation. Verbal ability also seems to be a factor, which makes sense because understanding language is often really important for understanding someone's perspective. Intelligence may help you understand others better, but it's not the only thing you need.
It's an interesting thought, though, right? Like, could someone who's constantly seeking out different perspectives, could they actually become more intelligent over time because of that exposure? It seems like there could be a feedback loop.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that hasn't really been explored fully yet. Moving on to strategy, it's pretty obvious that the way we actually go about trying to take someone's perspective really impacts how successful we are. Like if you just assume everyone thinks the same way you do, you're probably going to be way off base more often than if you really make an effort to imagine their specific situation and feelings.
Right.
And if you find some strategies that really work for you, you're also more likely to use them more often, which would boost your propensity,
Okay.
right? So the method you use to understand someone is just as important as the desire to understand them.
There's this work by Mendoza comparing situation-based and emotion-based perspective-taking strategies. He found that the best approach can depend on the context, like whether you're dealing with people you're close to or trying to understand someone who's done something wrong. And there's that study by Galinsky and Moskovitz on reducing prejudice. They had people write from the perspective of someone from a group they were prejudiced against, and it actually reduced their bias. So just having a specific strategy for taking someone else's perspective can make a big difference.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all approach, and learning some effective techniques is really key for boosting our perspective-taking ability. And then we have cognitive style, which is a little more abstract. Davis and Krauss define it as the way the individual thinks about the world. It can include things like how holistic your thinking is or how detail-oriented you are.
Okay. And how does that, our general thinking style, how does that relate to perspective taking?
There's this idea, particularly in gender and cross-cultural research, that a more relational or holistic cognitive style, like focusing on the bigger picture and how everything is connected, might be linked to a higher propensity for perspective taking. The thinking is that if you're already inclined to see things in a broader context, you might be more tuned into other people's viewpoints. Like Graham and Ike's talk about how women are often socialized to think this way, and Morris and Peng point to differences between Eastern and Western cultures. But it's tricky to separate cognitive style from gender and culture in research, so more work needs to be done. The idea is that your general way of thinking about the world might subtly influence how often you consider other people's viewpoints.
Interesting. So what about the connection between cognitive style and actual perspective taking ability, how good we are at it?
Studies have found a weak positive link overall, but it really depends on how they're measuring cognitive style. And there's this idea that the relationship might be curvilinear for a holistic style,
Meaning?
meaning up to a point, focusing on the situation is helpful for understanding others, but if you focus too much on the situation and ignore individual differences, you might actually become less accurate. So it's like finding that sweet spot, that balance between seeing the forest and the trees. A balanced perspective is what you need to really understand someone's perspective, taking into account both the situation and their individual personality.
Makes sense. Okay, we've covered the personal factors. Now let's switch gears and look at those situational factors that influence perspective taking. Gelbach breaks it down into features of the task itself and then the wider context. Let's start with the task.
All right, so he outlines 7 key features of the perspective-taking task. The first one is locus, which basically means whose perspective are you actually trying to take? Are you imagining yourself in their shoes, trying to see things through their eyes, or are you trying to be this, like, neutral observer? And are you focusing on an individual or a group? We tend to default to our own perspective, just because it's easier. Our brains like to conserve energy. So taking someone else's perspective takes more effort. You have to kind of consciously override that default self-centered view.
Right. And then there's the actor-observer bias, where we tend to blame our own bad behavior on the situation, but blame other people's behavior on their personality.
Right.
And the fundamental attribution error, where we underestimate how much the situation influences other people's behavior. It's like we have a harder time putting ourselves in someone else's shoes when we're watching them from the outside.
Totally. The second feature is decipherability. How easy is it to understand the person whose perspective you're trying to take? Are they expressive, consistent, or are they really closed off or even trying to deceive you? Obviously, it's harder to take someone's perspective if they're not giving you much to work with or if they're actively trying to mislead you.
Makes sense.
How this affects our motivation to even try, it's not totally clear. But you can imagine a really challenging target might make some people more curious while others just give up. But when it comes to accuracy, it definitely makes a difference. Like Ekman's work on facial expressions and deception shows how fake smiles, cultural rules about showing emotion, even just insincere expressions, all of that can really mess with our ability to read people. There's also this interesting finding by Bernstein and Davis that highly self-conscious people are actually easier to read, maybe because they just give off more information, even if they don't mean to. The clearer someone is in communicating, the easier it is to understand their perspective.
Yeah, the more signals, even subtle ones, the more data we have to work with. What's next?
Okay, the third feature is familiarity. How well do you know this person? We're naturally more likely to try to understand people we interact with a lot, like friends and family, just because we have more opportunities. And studies have found a small but noticeable effect of familiarity on accuracy too. We tend to be better at reading people we know well. There's this review by Colvin and his colleagues, and a study by Stinson and Ikes on male friends who are better at reading each other than strangers, both kind of point in that direction. When you know someone well, it's not just about shared history, it's like you have this mental radar that's finely tuned to understanding them.
And this ties into like the whole social psychology of prejudice, right? Concepts like outgroup homogeneity, where we see everyone in a group we don't belong to as the same, and in-group bias, where we favor our own group. These tendencies make it much harder to really understand individuals from groups we're not familiar with.
Absolutely. Then there's temporality, which is basically, are we trying to understand someone's thoughts or feelings about the past, the present, or the future? There's not a lot of research directly comparing these, but it seems pretty logical that we'd be most motivated to understand someone's present perspective because that's who's most relevant to us right now.
Makes sense.
And in terms of accuracy, we probably have the most information about the present, which makes our judgments more likely to be accurate. Past events might be easier to understand than future ones because we have hindsight and maybe even records to go by. There's also this work by O'Donoghue and Rabin on young people not always foreseeing future consequences, which kind of hints at how difficult it is to take a future-oriented perspective. Understanding someone in the present is easier because you have all this immediate information to go on.
Yeah, the more immediate and concrete the situation, the easier it is to grasp. What's the next feature?
The next one is reality, is the perspective-taking task about a real situation or a hypothetical one. Again, not a ton of research directly comparing these, but it seems like we'd be more motivated to try in real situations because they directly affect us.
Right.
And our accuracy is probably also better in real situations because there are more contextual cues to guide our understanding. Real-world situations give us more clues about what's going on in someone's head.
That lines up with the idea that the more information we have, the better we can understand. What about duration? How long we're exposed to someone? How does that factor in?
Duration mainly applies to ability, because it assumes you're already trying to take someone's perspective. And the idea is that longer exposure should lead to greater accuracy. For a couple of reasons. First, the more we practice, the better we get at perspective taking, like any skill. And then within a single interaction, the longer we have to observe someone, the more information we gather about their habits, background, personality, all that stuff. And that helps us make more accurate judgments. Bernstein and Davis kind of hinted at this in their study, but they didn't find a statistically significant effect. But it makes sense, right? The more time you spend observing someone, the better you're likely to understand them.
Like with anything, practice makes perfect, or at least better. And the last task feature is morality, whether the situation involves moral judgments. How does that play into things?
This one probably doesn't really affect our motivation to try, but it might impact our ability to be accurate. Moral dilemmas just add this extra layer of cognitive complexity compared to non-moral situations. There's this classic work by Kohlberg on moral reasoning, where people have to decide what someone should do in a tricky situation. And then you compare that to like the work by Taylor and Fisk, where they're looking at perspective taking in neutral situations. When moral issues are involved, there are often all these conflicting thoughts and feelings, which can make it harder to accurately understand the other person's perspective. Moral issues can muddy the waters and make it hard to see another person's viewpoint clearly.
Okay, so those are the features of the task itself. Now, what about the broader context surrounding the task?
Gelbach highlights two main contextual factors: cooperativeness and distractors. So a cooperative environment, one where the norms encourage understanding and working together, like Deutsch talks about in his conflict resolution work, is likely to increase both our motivation to take others' perspectives and our ability to do it well. Because in that kind of setting, it's expected and valued, and it creates a more open, trusting atmosphere. There's this study by Johnson that found a link between cooperation and emotional perspective taking in kids, which supports this idea. But it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. We don't know for sure whether cooperation leads to better perspective taking or the other way around, or if it's both. When you're in a supportive environment, it's both easier and more likely that you'll try to understand others.
Right. It probably works both ways. What about distractors?
Distractors, whether it's noise, other people, anything that's competing for our attention, it's going to make it harder to focus on the other person and really process the information we're getting from them. There's even research suggesting that when we're under a lot of mental load, it can make us less empathetic, even cruel. So a calm, focused environment is definitely going to be more conducive to good perspective taking. A chaotic environment can clutter your mind and make it hard to focus on understanding other people.
Makes sense. And Gilbach emphasizes that all these factors, they don't just work independently, they actually interact with each other.
Right. Snow is really big on that. The idea that to truly understand an aptitude, you have to look at those interactions. Like how your ability to regulate your emotions might interact with the temporality of a situation. For example, it might be much harder to understand a recent emotionally charged conflict than one that happened a while ago, just because you've had more time to process your own emotions and get some distance. These interactions are complex, and there's still a lot we don't know, but it just shows how dynamic perspective taking really is. The connection between your internal state and the world around you is key to understanding how well you can grasp another person's viewpoint.
Okay, so big picture, our deep dive today into Gilbach's work has revealed that social perspective taking is not just some simple skill, it's this really complex aptitude. And cognitive factors, motivation, and the situation we're in, they all play crucial roles.
Absolutely. And understanding all these different dimensions can give you, our listener, a much more nuanced way to view your own social interactions and how you understand the people around you. Recognizing how much your own motivation matters and how much the specific situation can influence things, that can be really eye-opening. Understanding someone is this complex dance between your internal world and the external circumstances.
And to leave you with something to ponder, given how multifaceted all of this is, what are some small changes you could make either in your mindset or your environment that could help you better understand other people's points of view? That's something worth thinking about. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.